The Shadow Guests by Joan Aiken. 6. Sim. Nearly 2 weeks away from the place had made Cosmo almost begin to doubt the existence of the mill house. He could hardly believe his own luck at being back. Everything was just the same, the sigh of the weir, old Lob stalking stately to meet him, the spiral of pittance glinting around the gray trunk of the walnut tree, Mr. Marvel's ducks chuntering happily where the brook joined the river, and the sound of Blossom's whinny up above the shoulder of the woodland. Everything was the same, but spring had advanced a notch or two. There were more leaves on the trees, the mud by the brook's edge was beginning to dry into flakes. Some gray hyacinths were spots of blue in Eunice's flower bed. Some grape hyacinths were spots of blue in Eunice's flower bed, and a pair of swallows were shooting in and out of the cart shed like Concord without noise. "It's the best place in the world," he said to Mrs. Tidings. "It is that. How your father had the heart to go so far and stay so long at the bottom back end of earth, I'll never know. He was trying to get away, but it didn't do any good. Made it worse. If it's laid on you... Made it worse. If it's laid on you, you ain't going to get away." Sorry, I'm trying to remember what her voice sounded like. "Made it worse. If it's laid on you, you ain't going to get away. Not if you go and sit on the South Pole. You might as well make up your mind to that. 2 things I can't abide. One's running away. The other's turning your back on a thing and letting on as it ain't so. Well, it's staring you in the face. Will you run along out, my lamb?" They were washing the breakfast dishes. "And don't you plague Miss Eunice, for she's all wound up in her book." "Of course I shan't." He ran out, steering a wide course round the end of the house where Eunice had her study. She really was wound up in her book, for she was correcting galley proofs like long, thick, extra-wide sheets of 100 paper, getting into a fearful tangle as she added more and more ink balloons full of mathematical formulas so that the proofs could begin to look like a mixture of worm cast and Ogham inscription. Eunice had told Cosmo about Ogham. It seemed a very useful and beautifully simple writing system. 20 different combinations of straight lines meeting each other. What a pity it was no longer used. The sun now was really hot, and though he did miss Con to a surprising degree, Con had been wonderful for doing things with, so much better than Mark. Cosmo was so full of plans he hardly knew where to start. The boats, the foals, he still hadn't explored the mill building. Then there was his camp on the island, where already new nettles were sprouting, and he must fetch a sickle from the tool shed and cut them down. There was a lot to do. Mr. Marvel could be heard clanking buckets in the barnyard, so Cosmo went to help him first. The pigs were coming next week, so the most urgent job was to get the pigsty built. Mr. Marvel had condemned the old pigsty as too small and unsanitary. He was knocking the 4 of them into one. "The sow's due to farrow 3 weeks after she gets here, so this'll do while the piglets are small," he explained, bashing away with a sledgehammer. "Then I plan to let them run in the orchard so as to clear the ground, because that's full of nettle and dock. Pigs are good for clearing, so long as you don't let them stay too long, then the ground gets pig sick." Rebuilding the sty took most of the next 5 days, on and off, and as an exchange, Mr. Marvel gave Cosmo help and advice with the boats. One of them, an old skiff, was not in too bad shape. A morning's work, with sealing compound and a couple of new pieces of planking, made it reasonably watertight. "Now you give her a day to dry off and a day's soaking in the water to take up," said Mr. Marvel, "and then she'll float like a nutshell. But keep away from the weir." The other boat, a punt, was in a much worse state of repair. They left it out, turned bottom side up, to dry out completely before trying to estimate how much would need to be done to it. Boats and water were something that had been missing from the life in Australia, except for those visits to the coast. And now Cosmo felt he could not have enough of them. He could never cross the footbridge without stopping in the middle to watch the water weeds waving their long filaments, the fish slipping past, and the diagonal patterns made by the current, while time flowed by, whole quarter hours together, as fast as the water and more silently. But Eunice said that time did not move, or at least not in the way people imagined. Einstein had showed that different things went at different speeds, or could even move in reverse directions. It was all rather hard to grasp. On the third morning, after the boat repair job, when Cosmo ran to see the skiff, left moored under the footbridge, had taken much water during the night, he was indignant to see a boy lying in the boat reading. "This is private land, you know. Didn't you see the notices?" Cosmo said rather sharply. His voice was sharper because, for a moment, he had hoped the boy was Con, but of course it wasn't. With considerable reluctance, the boy shut his book and slipped it into a pouch that dangled from his belt. He looked up at Cosmo, frowning short-sightedly. He had a rough, uncared-for appearance. Grayish skin, fuzzy, no-colored hair, bony hands, a few spots. No one would ever pick him out of a crowd for his promising looks. If he were in a basket with a lot of mugs, they would be marked seconds. His teeth were discolored from neglect, like buns, Cosmo thought, and his voice, when he spoke, was a croak as if he had not used it for some time. "I ask your pardon. I hoped that you would come this way. That was why I waited here. I thought no harm. If I have offended, forgive me." His voice was quite different from what Cosmo had expected. Rough, with some kind of country accent, but very polite, rather humble, in fact. "Waiting for me? I'm sorry I didn't—" Now Cosmo felt embarrassed, felt he had been rude, but the boy was such a poor, dismal-looking sort of irk, with his big hands and feet, his shabby nondescript clothes, and his doubtful, propitiating look. Like Bun, again, Cosmo couldn't help wishing that he would go away. He looked dull, that was the trouble. "Did Mr. Marvel tell you to come?" Cosmo asked, thinking ungratefully. I'm lonely, but not for this kind of company. I'd far sooner be on my own." They said I could learn from you. So I have come to ask you to teach me. They said you would know me. I am Sim," the boy said, as though that explained everything. "I have brought my things," he added hopefully, pointing to a pile on the riverbank which Cosmo had taken for some bits of rusty iron thrown out by Mr. Marvel. Now, looking closer, he saw there was a kind of tunic, leggings of chainmail, a dented helmet shaped like Mrs. Tiding's jam cauldron, also rusty, and some terrible-looking contraptions that might be spurs. Now Cosmo was really taken aback. "Teach you?" he stammered. "What? What am I supposed to teach you? Geometry, stuff like that?" "Nay, no magic. I am a plain fellow." And indeed, Sim looked it. "Though I am fond of books," he admitted. "I was sorry when my father took me from the monastery." "What have I got to teach you, then?" "Why, to fight. I am going on the crusade, you see, next month, with my uncle, Aviron, my mother's brother. We are going to rescue the city of Jerusalem." Sim heaved a sigh as if he did not relish the prospect. "Why go?" Cosmo said, "if you don't want to." "Oh, I must. My father bound me into my uncle's service. He owed my uncle for a piece of land, so my service is a means of paying that debt. I must learn to manage a boat, for we shall be traveling over sea, and to fight." "Oh, well, I can teach you to row anyway. It's not hard. We may as well start now if you like. The oars are in the shed. Do you want it to help me get them down off the beams?" Poor Sim was as clumsy as he looked, all thumbs. Twice he was nearly knocked out by loose planks while they were taking down the oars, and then he slipped and fell into the water. But he took these misfortunes with unruffled good humor, laughing at himself for being such a jackass. It turned out that he could not swim either, so Cosmo had to teach him the rudiments of that, though the water was icy, much too cold for bathing, really, and would be for several weeks yet. Still, you could hardly let the poor wretch go off to the Crusades in such a state of ignorance and incompetence. "Keep your blades down, Sim. You'll knock yourself cold if you wave them about in the air like that. Only take your rest now. Let them trail back along the boat. Why isn't your father going on the crusade?" "Oh, he went once before when he was younger, when my Uncle Robert was killed. That's how my father inherited the manor. He was the second brother, you see." Cosmo did see. "And you were your father's eldest son?" "Aye, but he never loved me," Sim said resignedly. "He put me into a monastery when I was 6, And indeed, I would have been glad to stay there. A monkish life would be no hardship for me. Now that my younger brothers are growing, my father will have enough help at the manor. Did anyone ever tell you about a prophecy? Cosmo delicately avoided the word curse, but Sim looked wholly blank and bewildered. Father Anselm holds that prophecies are vain and wicked things, coming from the devil. I know nothing concerning any prophecy. Oh, well, forget it. Now Cosmo felt really angry. He was not quite sure with whom. Fancy sending this poor simpleton off to a crusade, though. He hardly knew enough to come in out of the rain. Certainly didn't know what was in store for him, nor, presumably, did the uncle who had taken his service as payment for a debt. What kind of fighting do you have to learn? Why, with sword and spear, what else? No use explaining. No use expecting people to use net and trident in the Holy Land, Cosmo supposed. Well, Mr. Marvel lets me ride his young horses. I suppose we could have a try at jousting. We'd better bring your armor along. It's in a shocking state. You can't go off to Jerusalem if it's all rusty like that. It'll all have to be scrubbed with a middle brush. But first, we'll soak it in something to get the worst off. Good grief, man, it's heavy. And you're expected to wear this in the desert? He imagined trudging through the Australian desert, weighed down by all those heavy iron rings. They were flat, about the size of halfpenny pieces, overlapping, sewn on a thick leather jacket, which in itself must have weighed 5 or 6 pounds. Cosmo discovered that Sim hardly knew how to ride even. He explained that there had been little opportunity in the monastery, save when very occasionally he had been sent on an errand, riding the choirmaster's ambling mule. Astride of flighty Juno, he fell off more often than he stayed on, so Cosmo transferred him to the more sober and biddable Punch. I wonder what you'll be riding out there in the desert. My uncle plans to take 6 chargers with him. Some nights wait till they reach Acre, and there buy Saracen steeds. But they are poor spindly things, my uncle has heard, not fit to carry a man of substance. These are more like his horses. And Slim looked respectfully at the massive Blossom, whose enormous hooves. And Sim looked respectfully at the massive Blossom, whose enormous hooves needed shoes the size of barrel hoops. Perhaps it was as well that Mr. Marvel was away today, buying seed at some superior agricultural supply store in Reading. Cosmo was not certain if he would have approved of the exercise Punch and Juno were receiving, though they seemed to enjoy it themselves. Keep your legs as straight as you can, Sim, Cosmo panted, remembering the nights in the Bayeux tapestry with their feet almost touching the ground. And sit back, not so far forward. Keep your center of gravity in your seat, man. I cry your pardon. I know not this center of gravity. They were tilting at each other with long ash poles, which were not really heavy enough. The points tended to fly up in the air. Cosmo presently had the notion of wiring old pound and 2 pound weights from a rusty set of scales he had found in the old dairy onto the ends. Then the points kept down satisfactorily, but were rather damaging if, as occasionally happened, they connected with the target. After a while, Cosmo had another good idea. He rigged up a punch bag made from a big plastic agricultural sack stuffed with insulating wool and suspended from a bough of the great oak in the middle of the pasture. Pretend it's a Saracen, no. Go on, you've got to, Sim, he shouted. If you don't spike him, he's going to spike you. I was not made for warfare, poor Sim gasped, as Punch cantered to a ponderous halt. What are you good for? Why, nothing, Sim said humbly. But Brother Lawrence said, I have good perseverance, he pronounced it. Perseverance. Cosmo had to admit this was true. Slim prepared to go on trying, as long as he was asked to, but presently, for the sake of the horses, they had to stop, and walk Punch and Juno till they had stopped sweating and were ready to be rubbed down. Then the chainmail. which Cosmo had left soaking in a bath of clear rust, had to be scrubbed and sanded. Mrs. Tiding's wire stove brush was some help here. So were the wire pot scours. A good deal of skin came off their fingers, too. What we really need, said Cosmo, I'm sure they must have them in factories, is some kind of big tumbling machine that would roll the stuff round in emery or against bristles until it was all scoured. Failing this, they had to do it all by hand. Here, however, Cosmo had to admit Sim showed his merit as a companion. He might not be able to do anything else well, but he could sing in a clear, tuneful voice, and knew all kinds of songs, from monastic chants and hymns to funny little jingles, some of which, he admitted with a blush, he had made up himself. My beautiful sister Alice deserves to live in a palace. Her hair is bright as the golden fleece, and the troubadours call her Belle Alice. The words are pretty silly, Sim, said Cosmo kindly, rubbing away at a legging. But the tune is first-rate. I can play on a lute, too, Sim offered. The choir master had one, but of course, he added sadly, you can't take a lute on a crusade. Cleaning the armor proved a 4-day job. The clear rust, as Cosmo had predicted, only took off the worst. After that, it was a case of steady rubbing, with a bit of sword practice in the afternoons. At the end of each day, Sim was so exhausted that he seemed to go out like a candle flame. Cosmo was pretty tired too, but he supposed he must have more stamina. Poor Sim looked as if he had never eaten a full meal in his life. Just the same, Cousin Eunice, emerging from her proof, said, Are you all right, Cosmo? We hardly seem to see you. Oh, yes, I'm fine, he said. It's just, there's a job I've got to do. Well, don't overdo it. By Friday, the armor was reasonably bright. They had given up over the spurs, wicked spiked things with enough rust on them to give any horse gangrene. I'd leave them behind, honestly, Sim, Cosmo said. You're not the world's best rider. One jab with those and your horse will have you into the Dead Sea. Then they did some bow and arrow practice. Cosmo suspected that this might be more useful than all the spear stuff. He had heard that the Saracen attack was a kind of guerrilla warfare, darting over the sand dunes, sending off a flight of arrows and galloping away into the distance again. Unfortunately, Sim was a hopeless shot. He could not seem to hit anything that was smaller than a door or farther than 3 feet away. You need glasses, pal. Glasses, spectacles. I know not spectacles. The poor boy was so desperately short-sighted. When he read his little book, Lives of the Saints, he held it 3 inches from his nose. Anyway, Cosmo reflected, I suppose you could hardly wear glasses under that saucepan. Put it all on, Sim, and let's see how you look. So piece by piece, the armor was hung or jammed onto Sim. The short tunic, or hauberk, with sleeves coming down to the wrists, and chainmail gloves to match. The leggings, or chasses, also with chainmail sewn into cloth, and the eye-slitted helmet, which, when put over his head, suddenly turned the inoffensive Sim into a highly sinister figure. There ought to be a shield, a sword, and a spear, of course, he said. But those my uncle will provide. Cosmo had forgotten about the shield. Blimey, that is well. How much does the shield weigh? 10 or 12 pounds at least. And the sword. You had better do some weightlifting exercises, Sim, to thicken up your biceps. Like this, see? 20 or 30 times every morning and evening. Sim heaved another long sigh. You know not, friend, how fortunate you are to dwell in this peaceful spot, and not be required to ride off and rescue the holy places from the infidel. Oh, I do know, pal, Cosmo answered sadly. I do know, believe me. Are you all fixed up now? Want a trial fight with staves to see how you manage in your armor? I thank you, no. Sim was firm. There will be fighting enough by and by, and you have been too good a friend these last few days for me to wish to fight you any more, even in play. God help you. When I come back... His voice wavered a moment. When I come back from the crusade, I shall visit you again. and shall have great tales to tell, and many trophies to show. Of course you will, said Cosmo, feeling as if his heart were breaking. Twilight was beginning to thicken. He said, Is your uncle going to come and pick you up here, or what? I am to meet him this eve, at the head of the lane, where it meets the causeway. So I had best be off. Adieu, my good friend and helper. When two grown men bid farewell, they think no shame to embrace, he said, and hugged Cosmo, nearly tipping himself over. Then he slumped away at a slow but dogged pace, swaying slightly from side to side, but each time just managing to recover his balance. Cosmo watched him vanish into the twilight and heard his small, clear voice raised bravely in one of his own songs. See the Crusader stride up the lane, he will be a hero when he comes again. Gallant they are who now have gone, with helmet and sword, to Ascalon. If he be not in battle slain, he will be a hero when he comes again. And that is the end of chapter 6.